What I tell people is you don't have to understand, you just have to believe. But what I also believe is that belief becomes the bridge to understanding. If you and I can have a conversation and you're starting it in the framework of, okay, I don't understand what this woman is talking about. Gender, sex, what? But if you can believe that what I'm telling you is true, then your mind is open to understanding.
Welcome to yourbrilliance.com. I'm your host, Amy Waterman. By now, it's a no-brainer that women should support women. It's our job to stand together and lift each other up. Now, you may feel very comfortable standing with women from different backgrounds, different races, different sexual orientations, but there's one place where not everyone knows how to stand, when we're shoulder to shoulder with our transgender sisters. Now, here at Your Brilliance, we believe that we are all women together, and it's our job to support each other. Now, that's a job we could be doing better. We could do more to showcase diverse voices. We could do more to address the breadth of women's experiences. Now, you may have never had anyone challenge your gender identity, but not all women are so lucky. Our guest for today has had to fight for her right to be who she is. And once you hear her story, you'll understand why she says, you don't have to understand her, you just have to believe her. Dr. Bethany Grace Howe is the CEO and founder of Trans Health Data Collective, a nonprofit dedicated to improving healthcare for transgender individuals. She's a freelance journalist with 20 years of experience in journalism and teaching, as well as a doctorate in mass communication and media studies. And in her spare time, she moonlights as a stand-up comedian. Welcome, Dr. Howe.
Good morning or afternoon or whatever it is where people are watching and when.
So, of course, the very first question I have to ask you is, not long ago, on June 15th, the Supreme Court finally ruled that gender identity is protected from discrimination. How did that make you feel?
That was a great day. I mean, that seems like saying Siberia is cold. I think, you know, for LGBT people as a whole, it was obviously very important that it is now codified by law that we can't be fired for being who we are. And I think that's going to have spin-off effects in a lot of other areas where we're still fighting, like being allowed to remain part of the military, and anti-bullying initiatives in school, of course, within the federal government's definition of those people who are entitled to health care and that kind of thing. But what I think for transgender people especially, and I'm not sure if most people appreciate this, it was the first time that the Supreme Court has ruled, not even ruled, it is the first time that the Supreme Court has codified transgender people as a discernible and distinct identity. And I hope I'm not getting that wrong because I don't profess to be a legal scholar. But there's been a lot of discussion about, say, gay marriage and other, like the right to have gay sex in your own home, which seems mind-boggling to me. But this is the first time that transgender people were identified by the Supreme Court as saying, this is a distinct group of people that have rights just like any other distinct group of people. And so it's, you know, it's beyond the Sally Field moment of you like me, you really like me. It actually transitions, pun intended, into you see me, you acknowledge me. And to have both of those, I think when so many of us were expecting that things were going to go the other direction, it wasn't just a shock to the system. It was, I have to be honest, one of those things I didn't dare imagine. And so, yeah, it was a very good day.
So this has been such a long, hard road for you. You know, for cis women, you're right. We take being a woman for granted. We don't have to prove ourselves to anyone. But for you to be who you are, that has taken a lot of fighting. And I want to know, what was life like for you 5 years ago?
Well, you know, one thing is, and I don't know if it's a correction, but I think the standard transgender narrative is the one that people are familiar with like the Vern Cox, Caitlyn Jenner is. I have felt this way my entire life. It's what we call the wrong body discourse. I've always been trapped in the wrong body. And I have to be candid, the vast majority of transgender people I know, that is their story as well. That really wasn't me. I just grew up feeling different. And I grew up feeling weird, which actually didn't bother me. I kind of liked being on the edge of whatever. I think it was, though, just one day I had this sort of triggering event, and it was, I guess, kind of like a floodgate opening. And all of a sudden I went from, oh, I've heard of transgender people, to in the space of about 5 months, discovering, deciding, realizing, whatever you want to say, that I was a transgender woman. And so I mentioned that because I think sometimes we hear stories that are discordant with the traditional narrative, and you're like, well, then you must not be transgender. And I'm like, no, trust me, I am. I know. But also, I mention it because just every transgender person's story is different. And mine's got a lot of misery embedded in it. But overall, the struggle has been wrestling with my own demons and not so much society's, which means I'm very lucky. But, 5 years ago it was, and I'll never forget this, I started working on my PhD at the University of Oregon, and they, went around the room and asked everybody their pronouns. And I wasn't out yet. I wasn't even sure I was going to be out. And I raised my hand and I went, him. And it just felt so weird. And so the months that I spent living in this sort of dual space of trying to figure it out, I just felt like I was lying all the time and lying to everyone around me. And what that's made me aware of is that the vast majority of transgender people that I know, that 4 to 5 months of just weirdness, of discomfort, of lying, that has been their entire life. And it's paralyzing, and it's also polarizing within your own self. And so it's just, I think, when you finally come out of the closet, whatever closet it is, it's why it's so relieving, because you're finally telling the truth about yourself.
So I want to know a little bit more about the environment in which you came out. I know that you are very proud of your affiliation with the University of Oregon and that it created a supportive environment for you. What did they get right in supporting you?
I actually did a research paper on this, so I was like, what did you do right? I want everyone else to do it. I think the first thing was that there were just a lot of things there saying this is a safe environment, in terms of, having a gender neutral bathroom and including the terminology and acknowledging differing pronouns. I mean, just little things. But having said all that, when I came out, I was still scared out of my mind. And I realize now I should not have been, but as a human being, you have to be. And what transpired in the days and weeks afterwards was I had professors emailing me and just saying, hey, I don't tell everybody this, but my granddaughter used to be my grandson. You know where my office is. Here's my phone number. You stop by anytime you like. Or, another professor coming up and slapping me on the back a little bit and saying, congratulations, you're the transgender poster child for the School of Journalism. And I asked, do we get t-shirts? We do not. But he wanted me to understand the journey I was about to embark on as sort of a role model, a figurehead. I had my peers reach out and just say, hey, congratulations. Love the dress. Whatever it was. I mean, just little things like that. And then most critically, the dean, invited me in to talk to her. And at first I was like, oh, good. Another one of these sort of mandatory things you say when you want to be understanding. And one of my professors said, no, she means it. And if she's asking you what this school needs to do, you tell her. And I told her, and everything I asked, she did. And I mean, I didn't shoot for the stars, but I mean, I asked for things that I thought would improve the daily lives of students. And she, and then the dean that followed her, spent the next 3 years making those happen. And so I think that's the big thing, is that a lot of people, and we're seeing this with BLM, they stand up and say, we support this. But then when you ask them to put that support into tangible, actionable items, they'll give you a litany of reasons why they can't. the University of Oregon simply said to me why they could and why they would. Not all the time. Sometimes they said this is just not something we can do yet, but they would explain it to me. And the vast majority of things, though, it was, if you want to do this, girl, you go do it.
One of the things you said about, your professors coming to you and saying, I don't normally tell people this, but, maybe my grandson was my granddaughter or vice versa. I think that conversation really got kickstarted about 5 years ago when Caitlyn Jenner, we love to hate the Kardashians, but Caitlyn Jenner sparked a real national conversation when she came out and she talked about it publicly. I know you've got a really interesting connection to the Caitlyn Jenner Foundation. Could you quickly talk about how she inspired you?
Yeah, well, Caitlyn Jenner, I mentioned earlier that for me, there was a triggering event that sort of opened the floodgates. Seeing Caitlyn on the cover of Vanity Fair was it. And I remember I was still teaching high school at that point, and I had one of those classrooms that looks like Starship Enterprise. So I had a big monitor on the wall, put that cover up, and I was just sitting there looking at it, just dumbfounded. And a couple of my students walked by like, is he going to do that? And I'm like, no. And at the time I meant it. And they acted like they had just asked somebody overweight if they were pregnant and skulked off. But she started the internal conversation I had with myself. And I've thought about that a lot. We're both about the same age. I mean, she's, about 15 years older than me, but we're certainly not young, either one of us. I grew up looking at her on the Wheaties box. I mean, she had just, and I don't watch the Kardashians at all, but I had just always kind of followed Bruce Jenner along. As that went on, through a fluke, just one of those coincidences of the universe, I ended up meeting a very good friend of hers who I was like, you know what? And I knew I was going to meet him. And I wanted to say thank you to her for everything she had done. And so I wrote a thank you card, gave him the thank you card, and just said, if you would give this to Caitlyn, I would appreciate it. 2 weeks later, she called me on the phone. We started talking. Eventually, I started working with her foundation, and they founded, they basically sponsored my dissertation research. They allowed me to go all over the United States, interviewing dozens of transgender people about their experiences. That dissertation became 2 peer-reviewed papers that have been in pretty prestigious journals, and formed the foundation of what I'm doing now. And so along with being a friend, she and her foundation literally made possible the research that I was able to do. And, I don't know that a lot of people know that about her, but her foundation has sponsored quite a bit of both philanthropic and educational opportunities. I think I'm their first scholar, but I know they have plans to do more.
So as a parent, I really try and have conversations with my daughter about the difference between gender and sex and sexual orientation, but it is hard to know exactly the right words because I didn't grow up having these conversations with my parents, and I don't think hardly any of our parents talk to us about these things. You are a parent. Do you have any tips on how we can talk to our kids about the right language? Like, what's cisgender? What does it transgender even mean?
I think sometimes let's put it this way. I believe kids are a lot smarter than we give them credit for. So I do believe that, you give them some basic vocabulary, but at the same time, as an academic, I am keenly aware that at some point the vocabulary becomes a distraction to the idea. And so what I tell other parents, what I've had to learn is put it in frames they can understand. Give them some basic terms, some basic words, transgender, cisgender. But like the first discussions that my daughter and I ever had about it were just about mommies and daddies, and that mommies didn't have to be boys, and daddies, or mommies could be boys and daddies could be girls. And the reason we got to that was because originally, she was going to call me Maddie or some weird hybrid of mom and dad or whatever. And after 3 weeks, we both hated it. And it was like, why can't women be daddies? And so we started that conversation from where she was. And she kind of understands now that there are things that women can do and men can do. Women can breastfeed, men not so much. Women give birth, men no. But in terms of what makes a mommy or a daddy, that is disconnected from sex. Somebody once said to me, are you abdicating the male role in her life? And I said, I don't know. I said, before I transitioned, I had no idea how to use power tools. I suppose now I'm not obligated to teach her. I've thought about that. And what was I supposed to teach my daughter as a male that I'm not teaching her as a female? And so, she just turned 10. We are starting to discuss gender as a construct, which is just a fascinating idea to most people. But we started it by talking about the concept of time as a construct. That with the exception of the Earth rotating once every 24 hours and the Earth going around the sun every 365 days, every other sense of time that we have is something we created. It's not real. And time is a very understandable concept. So we talked about time as a construct first, and now that's allowing us to move into gender as a construct. And, my daughter sometimes wishes that she didn't have to take 2-hour car rides with me to get back to her mom. She said to me once, can we do anything that's not educational? No. Now there's a helicopter going overhead.
She shouldn't have had a teacher, right?
Everything, like we play a dice game that involves scoring, and I make her do all the math by hand. She's like, you could just tell me. And it's like, good, but I'm not gonna.
So one of the things that has been really exciting about this last couple of weeks is that until that Supreme Court case, it seemed as if all of the protections for transgender people were being rolled back. Their right to healthcare, their right to serve in the military, their right to use the appropriate bathrooms. And then JK Rowling came along, and she used her vast publishing platform to promote views that were discriminatory about transgender people. What fallacies and misinformation about transgender people frustrate you the most?
It's a long list. And, as a PhD, I'm required to make the list longer and more complicated and more confusing for people. However, I think for me, the most maddening is the one, and it's not as simple as bathrooms, but the narrative over and over again that one of the things JK Rowling said was, as a survivor of domestic violence, if I'm in a restroom and I know a transgender woman is in there, I'm terrified. And she's justifying her transphobia on her fear. And I'm not dismissing what it means to be, I'm not dismissing at all what it means to be the survivor of domestic abuse. Where I have problems is there's virtually no record anywhere of a transgender woman using their access to a bathroom as a means of preying on other women. It is a trope, it is a myth, it is a stereotype. And they used it in Houston a few years ago to beat back a civil rights law. They used it in North Carolina to pass a bill that they eventually, thankfully, discarded. And it to me is, it's not only intellectually dishonest, but what you're doing now is basically saying that people need to be afraid of me, that I am a predator and I am assumed a predator. And I don't get too passionately angry about too many things, but when I hear people talking about that I, as a transgender woman, should not be allowed near their children because I might be a safety risk, I was a teacher for 15 years and I kept my kids safe because that was my job. And now, just because I have changed my identity, suddenly I'm now a threat to your kids. There's no basis for it. There's nothing there. It is hate used to justify, it's fear used to justify hate. And we've seen that weaponized again and again and again throughout history. And we see it weaponized right now in this country against a variety of things. But yeah, JK Rowling just went, and I wouldn't even say she stepped in it, because that implies it was a mistake. No, she pursued it, magnified it, and has made transgender life worse for people in this world. And to me, that's unforgivable.
And another place where there's a lot of misinformation about transgender individuals is in healthcare. And you are going to change that. You have created a nonprofit to help healthcare providers and transgender people get access to the information and resources they need. Tell us about this new venture.
Yeah, you know, it's kind of funny. My research didn't necessarily go into this area, but it came up as I was researching. I wrote some articles for a medical journal about this. I got asked to speak at a conference. My life kept pulling me back this way about how transgender people have a hard time getting access to healthcare. In something like 85% of I think in 35 of the largest 50 metro areas, patients don't have access to a unified transgender health program. I'm not saying they can't get services, but those services don't connect. More specifically, a lot of transgender people, they don't just have a hard time finding transgender care per se, like hormones and that kind of thing. They have a hard time finding care because you have an enormous number of medical practitioners, and yes, some of them are transphobic. They don't want to talk to you. But more likely it is sort of, you know, as doctors, their job is to do no harm. And they have this belief that because you are transgender, they do not understand who you are medically, and therefore they are not qualified to treat you. And it can go to insane extremes. There's a story, and it's now, you know, called #transgender broken arm syndrome, but about somebody that went in to be treated for a broken arm, and they were told they needed to see a specialist because they didn't know how to treat them as a transgender person. And it's like, I had no idea my arm was trans. It's crazy. And so what the goal of this is twofold. Number one is there's more information coming out about transgender people all the time. And while the pool of data is not near as large as it needs to be, it's growing every day. What we intend to do is gather as much of that data as we can from as many sources as we can and put it in one place where anyone can access it. Anyone who's willing to contribute can get to it. Hospitals, individual doctors, researchers. And then from the nonprofit, anyone can do this. We're also going to do it as a sidebar, as a profit, but then analyze that data using artificial intelligence, item response theory, anything and everything to discern what are best practices. Right now, if you are a 48-year-old transgender woman who is considering surgery that is 52 pounds overweight, what should you be doing now, next, and what would be the most likely outcomes and the best processes to get there? And that all sounds really big. But I think personally, what I would really like to happen is that you are a physician practicing in, you know, Roseburg, Oregon. One of your patients walks in and says, I'm transgender and I need help navigating this. And as the physician, you're like, wow, I have no idea what that means. But you know what? Transers has a healthcare protocol. I can register with that. It's not going to be a ton of money. And everything I need to know to treat you, not just as a transgender person, but as an individual, is going to be there. And so the access to transgender care that is really faulty for a lot of people, it disappears. And I know it's possible, and it's an enormous amount of work, but it's possible. And that's what I want to do.
Now, for those of you watching, if you want to learn more about this initiative, if you want to learn more about Dr. Howe's activism and her research, we've got a link for you. Just go to yourbrilliance.org/how. That's yourbrilliance.org/HOWE. Thank you so much, Dr. Howe, for coming on the show. And I wondered if you had any last message you would like to leave our viewers with.
I'd like to leave them with the last thing you said before we started talking, and that is that there's a lot of stuff about being me that people are like, I don't understand. And I think sometimes we let that get in the way. And as a PhD, I'm all about understanding. But what I tell people is you don't have to understand, you just have to believe. But what I also believe is that belief becomes the bridge to understanding. If you and I can have a conversation and you're starting it in the framework of, okay, I don't understand what this woman is talking about. gender, sex, what? But if you can believe that what I'm telling you is true, then your mind is open to understanding me, other people, the truth of our lives. And so that's what I would say, is just believe.
Thank you so much. And thank you out there for watching. Now, did you have any aha moments or shifts in your thinking from watching this interview? If so, share them with us in the comments. And for more interviews like these, make sure to subscribe to Your Brilliance TV here on YouTube. And then come on over to yourbrilliance.com for more tips and insights on how you can live your most brilliant life. See you next time.